I want to start today with a question that it feels deceptively simple. It's the kind of thing you might hear in a classroom and you immediately tune out because you think you already know the answer. It feels basic.
Mm.
But stick with me here, because as we're about to find out, the answer is, well, it's anything but obvious.
I love those kinds of questions, the ones that seem like a small puddle, but then, you step in and it turns out to be an ocean. What is it?
The question is, what exactly is history?
Yes. Okay.
The heavy hitter.
Right. I mean, if I grab someone on the street right now and ask them what is history, they'd probably look at me like I was a little crazy. They'd say, it's the past.
Stuff that happened.
Stuff that happened. Or maybe it's a list of dates and battles and kings. Or, if they're feeling a bit poetic, it's remembering what happened so we don't repeat it.
All very common answers. And according to the deep dive we're taking today, all partially correct, but fundamentally missing the point. In fact, some of those definitions are exactly what our author argues history is not. Exactly. We tend to think of history as just stuff that happened. It's a big pile of facts. But today, we are going to completely flip that script. We're going to look at history not as a pile of facts, but as a specific way of thinking. A science, actually.
In a science.
One that was invented at a specific time by specific people for a very specific purpose. And to do that, we are diving into a classic. We are looking at The Idea of History by R.G. Collingwood.
This is a monumental text.
Yeah.
R.G. Collingwood was an Oxford philosopher and historian, and he was writing primarily in the 1930s and early 1940s. And the context here it's actually quite poignant. The material we're discussing, specifically the introduction and the section on Greco-Roman historiography, it comes from a book that was published posthumously.
Right, and that backstory just adds this whole layer of urgency to the text, doesn't it? Collingwood was a man racing against time. He had suffered a series of strokes. He knew his health was failing.
He was literally dying.
He was literally dying. And he was basically writing these ideas down while his body was shutting down, trying to reconcile his two great loves, philosophy and history.
And he was fighting a battle on two fronts, really. On the one hand, his own mortality, but on the other, he was fighting the intellectual establishment of his time. He was trying to prove that history wasn't just a scissors and paste job of collecting old stories.
What do you mean by scissors and paste?
Well, the idea that a historian just goes to the library, finds a bunch of old documents, cuts out the bits he likes, and then pastes them together into a narrative, just repeating what other people said. Collingwood thought that wasn't history at all. He argued that history is a rigorous science of the mind, perhaps the only way we can truly know ourselves.
And that's the mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack Collingwood's really radical argument. We're going to see how the ancient Greeks invented this tool called history, and this is the part that it blew my mind, why they were actually kind of terrified of it, why they didn't really trust it.
That is such a fascinating paradox we'll get to. The people who invent history don't actually believe it can offer true knowledge. It sounds like a complete contradiction, but when you understand their view of the universe, their metaphysics, it makes perfect, chilling sense.
And then finally, we'll figure out why, according to Collingwood, you can't actually know who you are or what you're capable of unless you think historically. So let's dive in. But first, we have to clear the brush. We have to define our terms because Collingwood is so particular about words.
Oh, he's a philosopher. Of course he is.
He starts by distinguishing between philosophy, history, and psychology. And honestly, I thought I knew the difference pretty well, but Collingwood corrected me pretty fast.
Yeah, this is crucial to get right because he is, in effect, redefining the entire landscape. He starts by defining philosophy. He says, philosophy is reflective. It is, quote, thought about thought.
Thought about thought. Okay, let's unpack that because that sounds like a bit of a tongue twister.
It does. But think of it this way. If you look up at the night sky and you study the stars, you're thinking about an object. The stars. That's astronomy. Collingwood calls that thought of the first degree.
Right.
You're thinking about something outside of yourself. You're cataloging the physical world.
So me thinking, look at that star, it's a red giant, it burns at this temperature, it is X light years away. That's first degree thought. I am the observer, the star is the object. Simple enough.
Exactly. But if you stop looking at the star and you start asking, how do I know that star is a red giant? What is the nature of the human mind that allows me to categorize it? What does it even mean to know something in the first place?
Ah.
Now you are thinking about the act of thinking. That is philosophy. It is thought of the second degree. You aren't studying the object anymore. You're studying the instrument you use to understand the object, which is the mind itself.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we apply this to our topic today, the philosophy of history isn't just a summary of world events. It's not someone saying, here's my grand philosophy about why Rome fell.
No, not at all. The philosophy of history, for Collingwood, is a study of how historians think. It's looking at the historical method itself as an object. It's asking, how does a historian take a piece of pottery or a forgotten letter and turn it into a fact about the past? What is the machinery inside the historian's head? It's meta-history.
Right, thinking about the thinking of history. Okay, that distinction makes sense. But then he brings in psychology, and this is where I got a little tripped up at first. Because if history is about understanding the human mind in the past, isn't that just psychology? If I'm studying why Brutus stabbed Caesar, am I not doing a kind of historical psychology?
You would think so, but Collingwood draws a very, very hard line here. Yeah. And it's a distinction that really clarifies what history is supposed to be for him. He says psychology studies thought as an event, as a phenomenon, something that just happens, like a feeling, an emotion, a neurosis.
It's a chemical reaction in the brain almost.
Almost, yeah. But history studies thought in relation to its object, specifically in terms of truth and knowledge. It's about the rational content of the thought.
I think we need a concrete example here. The source material uses Brutus and Caesar specifically, which is perfect. So how would a psychologist look at that assassination versus how a historian should?
Great question. So a psychologist analyzing Brutus might look into his childhood. They might say, well, Brutus had a difficult relationship with his father figure, and scadding Caesar was an expression of some kind of Oedipal complex or a deep-seated neurosis about authority.
Right.
They're looking for the cause of the feeling. They're treating Brutus's thought as a purely subjective event inside his skull. The actual political situation in Rome is, it's almost secondary to the emotional trigger.
It's almost mechanical. He felt angry, so he stabbed. Stimulus, response. The content of the thought, the why beyond the emotion matters less.
Precisely. But the historian and the philosopher of history couldn't care less about Brutus's feelings or his neuroses. The historian asks, what was Brutus's thought? And by thought, Collingwood means his rational calculation, the proposition.
So not what did he feel, but what did he think?
Yes. If I stab Caesar, I believe I will save the Republic. That's a thought. It's a plan. The historian cares about that proposition. Was it a reasonable political move at the time? Did it achieve its stated aim? Was the logic sound given the context of the late Republic?
So psychology deals with the subjective, the weird internal emotional wiring of a person. And history deals with the objective, the rational actions people take and whether they made sense in the world.
Yes. Psychology might explain why a person is too neurotic to live effectively in the actual world, to use one of Collingwood's phrases. But history is the study of effective action. It's about knowledge, not just mental events. If Brutus stabbed Caesar because he was hallucinating a dragon telling him to, that's a job for psychology.
Yeah.
If he stabbed him because he wanted to restore the power to the Senate, that's history.
Wow. Okay. That is a huge distinction. It carves out a very specific space for history as the study of rational human agency, which leads us perfectly into Collingwood's provisional definition of history. Before he really goes on to tear apart the ancient world, he sets up these 4 pillars of what history is.
And these 4 pillars are so important. They become the yardstick he uses to judge everything that comes after. If a text doesn't meet all 4 of these criteria, Collingwood basically says, that's interesting, but it's not history.
Let's run through them so we have our rubric ready. So number 1, the definition.
History is a kind of research or inquiry. In a word, it's a science. And, we should be clear. By science, he doesn't mean test tubes and lab coats.
Right.
He means it's a pursuit of answers to specific questions. You don't just sit down and write what you already know. You go looking for what you don't know. It is an active investigative process.
Okay, that's pillar 1. History is science. Number 2, the object. What does it study?
Res geste. It's Latin for things done, but specifically the actions of human beings in the past. Not gods, not nature, not geological forces.
Yeah.
Humans. It is, by its nature, anthropocentric.
Pillar 3, the method.
Interpretation of evidence. This is key. You can't just make it up, and you can't just do that scissors and paste thing of repeating what someone else said. You have to look at a document, or a coin, or a ruin, and you have to interpret what it means. It requires critical analysis.
And number 4, the goal. This one's my favorite. Why do we do it?
The end or goal of history is human self-knowledge. We study history not just to learn about dead people, but to understand what it means to be human.
To know what man can do, as he puts it so beautifully.
Right. And since we can't know what we are capable of until we try, the only real clue to human potential is to look at what humans have done. The past is the only mirror we have that's big enough to see ourselves in.
So that's the checklist. Science, human action, evidence, self-knowledge. Now, with that checklist in hand, Collingwood takes us back in time, way, way back before the Greeks. We're going to the ancient Near East, Sumeria, Babylon, Egypt. And he drops a bit of a bombshell.
He does.
He says that these civilizations, these incredible advanced cultures, did not have history.
It sounds so harsh, doesn't
Right.
it? I mean, we look at the pyramids or the great clay tablets from Mesopotamia and we think, surely this is history. They're recording their past. But Collingwood looks at it and he calls it quasi-history. And he breaks that down into two main types, theocratic history and myth.
Okay, let's start with theocratic history. He uses a really specific, brilliant example from a Sumerian inscription. It's about a boundary dispute between two city-states, Lagash and Umma. And on the surface, it reads just like a history report. It says, the king of Kish mediated the dispute and they set up a boundary stone. Seems historical.
It does.
But Collingwood looks closer and says, nope, not history. Why? What's missing?
The agent. The question of who is doing the option. In that inscription, yes, it describes the settlement, but it says the boundary was set up because, quote, the god Ningirsu and the god Shura deliberated. The king, this guy Mesalim, he's acting, but he's only acting at the command of his god.
So the human king is just a puppet. The real actors are the gods.
Exactly. In theocratic history, humanity is not the ultimate agent. The god is the agent. The king is just a servant, an instrument, a conduit for divine will. And Collingwood argues that if the ultimate cause of an event is that God Enlil was angry, then you aren't studying human action anymore. You're studying theology.
And you can't really analyze the reasoning of the god Enlil because he's a divine being. It's beyond question.
It's beyond question, and it also fails that first test, the inquiry test, right?
Okay.
These inscriptions aren't some scholar asking, I wonder what really happened between Lagash and Umma. They are a king carving into stone. Here's what happened, because I say so and because my God is powerful and willed it. It's a statement of known facts, usually to brag or to establish political or religious authority. It's not research. It's propaganda or worship, but it isn't history.
Okay, so that's theocratic history. Human actors, but they're just puppets for the gods. Then we have myth. How is myth different from theocratic history?
The difference is primarily about time and actors. In theocratic history, you still have human kings and real battles and specific places, even if the gods are pulling all the strings from behind the curtain.
But in myth...
In myth, you remove the humans entirely, and you remove dated time.
So it's just the gods.
It's just the gods, and it all happens in a timeless past. Theocratic history happens 10 years ago, or in the reign of my father. It's on our timeline. Myth happens in the beginning of things, once upon a time.
The example he gives is the great Babylonian poem, the poem on the creation.
Yes, the Enuma Elish. It describes the birth of the gods themselves. Apsu, Tiamat, Marduk. It describes this epic cosmic battle where the storm god Marduk kills the sea goddess Tiamat and creates the world from her carcass. It's a magnificent story. It's foundational.
But it's not history.
It's not history. There are no human actions, and it's not set in a specific dated past. It's completely outside of our time reckoning. It's dealing with the very structure of the universe, not the actions of men within it.
Collingwood points out something really interesting about the Hebrew scriptures here, too, the Old Testament. He says it's definitely an improvement on the Babylonian stuff, but it still ultimately falls into that theocratic bucket.
He treats the Hebrew scriptures with a lot of nuance, which I appreciate. He notes that unlike the Mesopotamians, whose gods were particularistic, this is the god of the city of Babylon, and that is the god of the city of Nineveh.
Right, local gods.
The Hebrew God is universalistic.
Yeah.
Yahweh is the God of everyone, of all nations.
Which creates a much broader story, a story of the whole world.
It does. It absolutely allows for a world history perspective, which is a huge leap forward. But Collingwood insists it is still theocratic history because the central actor is God. The divine acts are always the primary focus. It's still a story about God's will shaping the world, not primarily about human inquiry into human actions. So it's closer, but it hasn't quite crossed that threshold into scientific history yet.
So we've got this whole world for thousands of years with incredible civilizations. They have records, they have myths, they have king lists, but they don't have history in the specific scientific sense that Collingwood has defined. And then, around the 5th century BC, The Greeks show up.
The Greeks. Specifically the Ionians on the coast of modern-day Turkey, and then the Athenians. And this is where the whole game changes. The semantic shift happens. The word history, historia, it's a Greek word, and it doesn't mean the past.
It means inquiry.
Inquiry or investigation. And the man who really plants the flag in the ground is Herodotus.
The father of history.
A title he absolutely deserves, according to Collingwood. Because Herodotus starts his book with a very specific, very revolutionary preamble. He says he is writing this, and I'm paraphrasing, so that the deeds of men shall not be forgotten.
The deeds of men, not the deeds of gods. That's the shift right there.
That is the whole revolution in 3 words.
Yeah.
First, it is humanistic. He isn't writing about the deeds of Zeus or Apollo. He's writing about the Persians and the Greeks, human beings. And second, it is rational. He isn't just accepting traditions or sacred texts. He's trying to find out why things happen based on evidence. He asks questions. He investigates.
Okay, so Herodotus invents the game. He creates a science of investigating human action. You would think then that the ancient Greeks would be thrillingly excited about this, that they would embrace history as the ultimate form of knowledge.
And here is where it gets really, really interesting. This is the big aha moment in this part of the book. The Greeks, despite inventing history, actually had a philosophical worldview that was profoundly anti-historical.
This was the part of the reading where I had to stop and reread the page twice. The Greeks were anti-historical, but they were obsessed with their own glory, with being remembered.
They were, but we have to look at their metaphysics, their basic understanding of reality. Think about Plato. Think about the Greek obsession with mathematics, with geometry.
Okay, geometry, triangles, circles, things that are perfect and unchanging.
Exactly. For a Greek thinker like Plato or Aristotle, true knowledge, what they called episteme, could only be about things that are permanent, eternal, and unchanging. A triangle is always a triangle. 2 + 2 is always 4. It doesn't matter if it's today or 1,000 years from now or 1,000 years ago. That is reality with a capital R. That is what is worth studying.
And history, that contrast.
Well, what does history deal with? It deals with human actions. And what are human actions? They happen and then they're gone. They are fleeting. They are in a constant state of flux. They appear and then they disappear. A battle happens and then it's over. A king reigns and then he dies. It's all transient.
So to a Greek philosopher, you can't have science, you can't have episteme about something that just disappears.
Precisely. They classified historical knowledge not as episteme or real knowledge, but as doxa, which means opinion or belief. It's just perception. It's like watching shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. They believed that because the object of history, human events, is transient and gone, our knowledge of it can never be true. Scientific knowledge, it's just a collection of stories about things that don't really exist anymore.
That is such a wild paradox. They invent the tool, but their own philosophy tells them that the tool is basically useless for finding truth with a capital T.
And it explains so much about the way they wrote history. Because they didn't believe history could be a science of the eternal, they treated it as something, practical or pragmatic. It was useful, maybe. Thucydides certainly thought it was useful.
Useful in what way? Like, what was the point then?
Well, it could be a repository of examples, a sort of moral or political handbook. Tyrants usually fall. Democracies tend to become chaotic if they're not careful. They looked for patterns in human behavior.
But they didn't think you could create laws from it.
No, absolutely not. They didn't believe you could predict the future with certainty because human will is not governed by fixed, unchangeable laws the way nature is. You can predict an eclipse down to the second. You can't predict a war. So for them, history had value, but it was a practical value, like poetry or rhetoric. It was not real knowledge in the way mathematics was.
This philosophical distrust, this idea that history is just doxa, it had a massive impact on how they actually did history. It shaped their method. And this brings us to the really interesting limitations of the Greek historical method. Because they treated history like a legal inquest, like a court case, trying to figure out what happened. They had a very specific and very strict rule about evidence.
Yes. The absolute reliance on eyewitnesses.
If I want to know what happened at the Battle of Salamis, I can't look at an old scroll. I have to find someone who was at the Battle of Salamis and ask them what they saw.
Right. The Greeks were masters of the cross-examination. Herodotus, who was a bit looser, traveled all over the known world asking people, what did you see? What are your traditions? Thucydides, who was much stricter and more scientific, basically said, I only trust what I saw myself, or what I could verify from interviewing people who were definitely there and whose accounts I could check against each other.
Which sounds good on the surface. It sounds rigorous. It sounds like good journalism. But Collingwood points out a massive, fundamental flaw in this approach.
He calls it the tether.
The tether. Explain that.
If your entire historical method relies on questioning living people, then your history can only stretch as far back as living memory. You are physically tethered to the length of a human life.
So you can write about the Peloponnesian War while it's happening because you can talk to the generals and the soldiers.
Right.
You can maybe write about the Persian Wars a generation earlier if you can find some really old veterans in Athens before they die. But you absolutely cannot write a history of, say, the founding of Athens 500 years before your time.
It's impossible because the witnesses are all dead. For the Greeks, anything before living memory was just a black hole. They had no method for it. They couldn't do what a modern historian does. They couldn't, dig up pottery and date the layers of a city or analyze linguistic changes in ancient texts or interpret bureaucratic records to reconstruct the past. If there wasn't a guy you could interview, it wasn't history. It was just legend, myth, stuff for the poets.
So it effectively turned all of their history into what we would now call contemporary history, or even journalism.
That's exactly the word Collingwood uses, or memoir. He says Thucydides wasn't really writing a history of the ancient world. He was writing the memoirs of his own generation. He was documenting the present as it unfolded.
And this explains so much. It explains why the great Greek histories, like Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War, cover such incredibly short spans of time.
Yes. The Peloponnesian War covers, a few decades? They are incredibly detailed, zoomed-in snapshots of the present or the immediate past. But they completely lack the long view. They couldn't see the arc of centuries because their method, the eyewitness interview, physically prevented them from doing so. They were brilliant, but they were trapped in their own time.
It's fascinating. It's like they had this incredibly powerful microscope, but they had no telescope. They could see the cells of their own time in perfect detail, but they couldn't see the galaxies of the past.
That's a great way to put it. They drew this hard line between the age of heroes, the mythic past of the Trojan War and all that, and the age of men, which was the recent knowable past. And they felt they couldn't cross that line scientifically.
Okay, so this brings us back to Collingwood himself. We've kind of bashed the Greeks a bit, or rather, we've identified their limits, as Collingwood saw them, but we need to understand why he is so obsessed with all this. Why does he care so much about defining history as a proper science, distinct from what the Greeks were doing?
Yeah, this is where we need to look at the editor's preface in the introduction to the book again, to really get inside Collingwood's head. He wasn't just writing a dry textbook. He was fighting an intellectual war, a war against a group he called the realists.
The realists. Who were they?
These were the dominant philosophers at Oxford in his time, people like Cook Wilson. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a very strong movement to separate philosophy from history completely. The realists basically said, philosophy is about pure logic and eternal truths. History is just about stuff that happens. They're totally separate disciplines. One is clean, the other is messy.
And Collingwood said, that's garbage.
Essentially, yes. He was what's known as an idealist in the philosophical sense, which means he believed that all knowledge is, in some way, shaped by the mind. He argued that you can't understand a truth without understanding the mind that thought it and the historical context that mind lived in.
He gives the example of Plato, which is really helpful. You can't just ask, is Plato's theory of the ideal state true or false?
Right. That's a meaningless question for Collingwood. You have to ask a historical question first. What specific problem was Plato trying to solve in 4th century BC Athens when he wrote the Republic? You have to reconstruct the historical context to understand the philosophy. So for Collingwood, philosophy is historical. You can't separate the idea from the thinker and the time. They're intertwined.
Okay, so he was fighting the realists, and he also had, as you put it, beef with the positivists. This is another ism we should probably clarify.
The positivists were mostly 19th century thinkers who tried to turn history into a natural science, like physics or biology. They were obsessed with finding the laws of history.
Like a scientific law.
Exactly. Just like Newton found the laws of motion, they wanted to find the laws of history. They wanted to be able to say, if you have condition X, like a feudal system, then Y, a revolution, will always follow.
Like meteorology, there's a high-pressure system, so it will be sunny. They wanted that level of predictability for human society.
Precisely. And Collingwood rejected this completely. He said history is a science, yes, but it is a science of the mind, not a science of nature. And this is a crucial difference. Nature follows laws. A planet has to follow the law of gravity. But human beings follow reasons.
A law is external and compulsory. Gravity pulls me down whether I like it or not. But a reason is internal. I choose to act for a reason because I think it will get me what I want.
And that's the whole ballgame. You can't predict human action like you predict an eclipse because humans have free will and act according to their own thoughts and plans. And that leads us to the ultimate value of history for Collingwood. Why do we even do it? It's not to predict the future. He thought that was a fool's errand. It's not just to collect facts like a hobbyist.
It's for self-knowledge.
We're back to that fourth definition. History is for human self-knowledge.
Think about that quote you mentioned right at the start. It's so powerful. Knowing yourself means knowing what you can do. And since nobody knows what he can do until he tries, the only clue to what man can do is what man has done.
It's just a fantastic line.
It's an incredible idea. I don't know if I have the personal capacity for great courage unless I look at history and see that other humans, people made of the same stuff as me, have shown great courage. I don't know if our species is capable of terrible, unimaginable evil unless I look at the history of atrocities and see what we've done.
Exactly. History expands your identity beyond your own small life. If you don't know history, you're trapped in the tiny box of your own personal experience. You only know what you have personally done. But if you know history, you possess the experience of thousands of generations. You realize that you are part of a much larger story, capable of both the sublime and the horrific.
And this connects to his most famous concept, the idea of reenactment. It comes up later in the book in more detail, but it's teased in the introduction. The idea that the historian isn't just a passive spectator watching a movie of the past.
No, absolutely not. To truly understand history, Collingwood says you have to reenact the past thought in your own mind. To understand why Caesar crossed the Rubicon, you can't just read the date in a book. That's useless. You have to sit in your study, look at all the evidence you have, the letters, the political situation, and reconstruct Caesar's predicament in your own mind.
You have to think his thoughts.
You have to think Caesar's thought. You have to run the simulation in your own brain. You have to think, okay, I am losing political power in Rome. My enemies are waiting for me. If I stay here in Gaul, I am ruined. If I cross that river with my army, I am officially a traitor, but I might win everything. You have to feel the weight of that decision.
And when you do that, when you reenact that rational process, the past isn't dead anymore. It's not a foreign country.
It lives again in your mind. You literally possess the thought of Caesar.
Yeah.
That, for Collingwood, is how history becomes knowledge. It's a mental act that bridges the gap of time. You aren't just remembering what Caesar did. You are relearning the rational process that led him to do it.
That's actually kind of spiritual in a completely secular way. It means the past is never really gone as long as there is a historian who is willing and able to rethink it.
It is. It's a beautiful defiance of death and time. You have to remember, Collingwood himself is dying as he's finalizing these ideas in 1943. And he's arguing that the human mind has this incredible power to transcend time. He was, in his own way, proving that the mind is not just a biological event that flickers out, but something that can connect across centuries through this act of historical reenactment.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this. We started with that simple question, what is history? And we have come a really, really long way.
We certainly have. We saw that for thousands of years, great civilizations like Sumeria and Babylon didn't have history as we know it. They had theocratic records lists of things that gods did through their human servants. They had myths about the beginning of time.
Then the Greeks Herodotus and Thucydides came along and invented the inquiry. They made it humanistic, focusing on the deeds of men, and they made it rational, basing it on evidence.
But they were held back. They were held back by their own philosophy, which told them that the changing world of human events wasn't real knowledge, and they were held back by their method, which tethered them to living memory. They couldn't break the barrier of the present.
And finally, R.G. Collingwood comes along and, in a sense, liberates history from these limitations. He defines it as a rigorous science of the mind, a way to investigate human action by interpreting evidence with the ultimate profound goal of understanding human nature itself.
And in doing so, he elevates history to arguably the most important science for human beings. Because without it, we are strangers to ourselves. We are, in a sense, amnesiacs wandering through the world with no idea of who we are or what we can do.
That brings me to the final thought I want to leave everyone with today. Collingwood suggests that without history, we don't actually know who we are. We only know our current fleeting moment.
Which raises a pretty frightening question for the modern world, doesn't it? I mean, we live in an age that is utterly obsessed with the now. We're obsessed with the 24-hour news cycle, the latest tweet, the immediate emotional reaction. We seem to be slipping away from the long view.
So the question is this. If history is the only real way to know what human beings can do, and if we, as a culture, stop thinking historically, do we lose our own definition of humanity? Are we slipping back into that Greek world of doxa, of mere opinion, where everything is just a fleeting shadow on the wall and nothing is ever truly understood in its context?
It's a real danger. If we lose the capacity for historical thinking, we don't just lose the past. We lose the map to our own potential. We lose the ability to understand why we do what we do and what we might do next.
On that cheery note, but seriously, maybe look at your own living memory differently today. Ask yourself what you're just remembering as a story versus what you're actually investigating as a historian of your own life.
And maybe write it down. You never know who might need to reenact your thoughts in 1,000 years.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.